There are two sorts of process that can take place inside of us, speaking psychologically rather than physiologically, that is. And one would be an unconscious process, the unconscious process, and the other would be a conscious process. The unconscious process is the default thing that happens all the time. It happens without us knowing about it, needless to say. That's how come it gets to be unconscious. So we don't have to get it to happen. Whereas the conscious process can only happen consciously. It's not going to happen unless there is consciousness there. An unconscious process is, we can talk about it in the same way that we can talk about the formation of rust. So if you get some nice new shiny iron, a sheet of corrugated iron or something like that, you don't have to worry about how it's going to get rusty and how will I make the rust come, what do I have to do. That just all happens, it gets rusty. So when we go that direction, everything happens by itself and we don't have to worry about it happening. The other way of things is therefore a rarer way, because it's much, much easier just to go along with what's happening and imagining that we are conscious when we're not. Imagining we're conscious when we're just going along with the mechanics of the situation. Obviously, that's much, much easier. And also, it's kind of all we know, really. Sometimes people sometimes call that the state of passive identification. We're passive, but we're identifying with this thing that's happening, and we feel that as being an expression of our engagement or our autonomy. We think we're doing it, basically. So it's kind of like a cheat. It's kind of like an easy way of doing things. What happens when we go along with the unconscious process is that we get tangled up. We get tangled up with mechanical rules. The mechanical rules get into us and infest us and condition us and get us to do whatever it is the mechanical rules want us to do. In Gurdjieffian terms, we get tangled up with the personality, so essence gets hopelessly tangled up or intertwined with personality, with the result that we think that the personality is us. But the personality is always just a husk, it's just a mechanical thing that doesn't belong to anyone. So we absorb little bits and pieces of it, and it all comes together in us in some kind of jumbled up kind of a way. And it's all external units, ready-made external units that have no autonomy. They have nothing to do with the individuality of who we are. They're generic identikit bits of material floating around, meme-like in the culture, and we assemble inadvertently via a non-conscious process and an identity, much as certain sea worms would assemble a casing for themselves by picking up little bits of broken shell and bits of sand and sticking them all together, and then that helps them and protects them. So we do the same thing with the identity, but it's of a completely opposite nature to essence, because essence can be revealed by scraping away the personality, perhaps, but it can't be assembled. So the run-of-the-mill process is the process by which what is not us gets to seem like us, and we go along with that via the act of passive identification. So that's, as I said a few minutes ago, that's the default. That's what happens if we don't pay attention, bring consciousness to the picture. So it's pretty dire default. It's not got a lot to recommend it, obviously. It takes us to a bad place because we're never being true to ourselves. We're just going along with what the conditioning wants us to do, and that's never going to take us to a good place. It's like spending your whole life doing what everyone else wants and doing what you're told and never working out what you yourself want. That ends up in a place that isn't a good place because there is immense regret, if that's the right word, or remorse, or a feeling of opportunity or potentiality totally squandered. And when the awareness does come into the picture, it will be a very painful awareness because we will be aware of the horrific loss of potentiality that was there. So the unconscious process, the default process, is a painful one. It's also a process that is very much encouraged and facilitated by our particular type of culture, which is the type of culture that focuses entirely on the outer life, the external life, which is the life we live on the basis of who we're told we are, or we assume we are. And that life, that external life, makes total sense just as long as who we're told we are is who we are. And were we to see that who we are led to believe that we are is that's not us at all, then that's kind of a horrific thing. It's a horrific awareness to have. Now, possibly as we go through our lives, we're not particularly aware of the horror of this situation, but suffering increases, and there'll be feelings, maybe not a direct awareness of what's going on, but maybe glimpses of it, refracted glimpses of it, echoes of it, displaced kind of feelings that we don't really make sense of, but there will be a sense there. We can look at depression in this way and say that major depression is suffering that comes when we realize that we're a sham, when we realize that we are hollow of anything true, hollow of who we truly are, and that it's all a pretense. And in acute clinical depression, people will often say, oh, exactly that, in almost exactly those words. That will be the general gist of it. So that is a uniquely painful type of awareness. And it can be seen that when we're talking about it like this, it's not an illness or it's not a dysfunction. It is a consequence of what we are doing, an inevitable consequence of not what we're doing. Now we could ask, well, how come everyone doesn't get depressed in that case? It's pretty much all of us are mistaking the idea of who we are for who we really are. And that's a kind of tricky question. Because I don't know the answer, so it's tricky for me. But I suppose what we can say is we do have a certain leeway to disconnect ourselves from our suffering, to disconnect ourselves from what's really going on, the insulation factor. And if our insulation is good enough, it can actually insulate us pretty well so that we never become, well, I wouldn't say never, but mostly don't become aware of it. So when people get depressed, when we get depressed, that separation between us and how we actually feel and the awareness that attends our actual situation is gone. We're in a more truthful situation, which is funny because we all say about people who are depressed that it's completely unreasonable, completely irrational, that there's no basis at all for it, really. We're very keen to say that, super keen to say that. Because we could meet someone who's got a perfectly good life situation in terms of their external life and say, look, you've got all the things all of us want. You've got a partner, you've got a good job, you've got a good house, you've got a car, you've got all of the things, whatever the things are, whatever they are. There's no point in us going into an exhaustive list. It's just the things. So how could you possibly, how can you, there's no validation and justification of feeling depressed there, because your outer life is good if it is good. Sometimes it isn't good as well, of course, in which case we can't make that argument. But when it is good, it's like perplexing, and we talk about endogenous depression mysteriously coming into being because of the mysterious malfunction of the brain chemicals, etc., whatever. That kind of theory's been disproved pretty emphatically in the last few years, but whatever other theory you might want to come up with it. But in terms of the way of looking at things that we're talking about here, depression is the inevitable consequence of passively identifying with a robot version of us who isn't us. And that goes on all the time, and it's easy to see it going on all the time. Were we to stop fixating on the outer, on the external events of our lives, and look at the one who that life is happening to, or the one who is living, supposedly living that life, we would inevitably become aware of this situation, that who we thought was us not being us. So that's a universal thing. Everyone always discovers that when they are taking an interest, because that is what is there to discover. There's nothing else to discover. We discover fakery. We see through levels and levels, layers and layers of fakery, like layers of skin in an onion. Pretty demoralizing, really. You strip away one fake self and there's another one hiding underneath it. So we could get pretty depressed about that. And it's not the same as being depressed. Being depressed is when that awareness has been held at bay for a long, long time, and it suddenly jumps on us all at once, the whole weight of it. Whereas if we're going along with a conscious process, we want to be aware of it. We're actually interested in it. And that means that we are, to some extent, not wholly identified with the personality. We can be ironic about it, so that when we discover that it's false, that's interesting. It's painful, but it's interesting as well, because there's relief, freedom from being freed from the false. So it's like hurt, but there's freedom behind that hurt. It opens us up. So when we get into the conscious process, it's not the same as a volitional process, because there's no thing that we do, no book of instructions telling us how to do this thing, because that's just more conditioning. That would be more rules. Got nothing to do with consciousness. So it's not volitional, but it's a process we can assent to and go along with in an interested way, participate in an interested way. So it's kind of like what you could say is seeing the pain because you want to see it where it actually belongs, rather than refusing to see it and then being compelled to experience it in a disguised or deflected or displaced way. So it's the pain either way, but one way it's kind of helpful pain, one way it's conscious suffering, the other way it's unconscious suffering. Conscious suffering frees us up. So the conscious process is when we're on board for this series of discoveries. And so what the conscious process is the separation of what is truly us from what is not us, but which we mistakenly thought was. Which is a key Gurdjieffian idea, the separation of I from not I. And this is a process that goes against the dominant process, the dominant unconscious process, which is also the process of society, where we are pretty much compelled to identify with labels of ourselves, false identities. You are this, you are that, you like this, you like that. This is the type of person you are. Which we're told from a very, very early age, and it sticks, obviously, it sticks to us. But because it isn't who we are, because it is fake, it takes us down a path of suffering. So that's where the neurotic suffering comes from. Not being yourself, not knowing yourself. They may be saying not being yourself is misleading because it implies that there is a true self somewhere for you to be. And actually what we find out is that there is no true self or true identity. All notions of selfhood are just another layer of the onion. So what there is instead of some kind of authentic self that we can say, yes, this is me, at last I found my true identity. What there is instead of that is freedom. The freedom not to be anybody in particular, the freedom not to be, as Robert Wyatt puts it, the freedom not to be. You don't have to be this or that. You don't have to wear this mask or that mask. There's no compulsion in that way at all. But because the process of separating personality and essence goes against all the other influences in our lives, goes against what is happening to us in our lives and the pressure that we're under from everyone else, it's not something unnecessarily is going to happen. Something has to change within us for us to actually understand about it and be interested in it. And what that something is, it's very hard to say. Possibly it could be the case that eventually the pure weight of futility and frustration and suffering that attends the inauthentic or conditioned life becomes so much that we get roused from our slumber and don't want to have anything more to do with it. And that's pretty much like an addiction. In an addiction, we start off being in love with whatever we're addicted to. It seems to be genuinely good to us. At the tail end of an addiction, if we don't get killed first, we realize that it's an enemy, and we get so fed up of being fooled, the addiction's telling us we're going to go somewhere good and we don't, that on a very, very deep level, a core level, like in our bones, we're just fed up with it. We've done it so many times and it's caused us absolute suffering every time, and eventually one day it's like, no, I don't think so. I don't think I'll go along with it, because that little bit of illusion which allows us to believe that it's going to work out for us, or there's going to be actual happiness in it or fulfillment, no longer works. because we've got too wise for it. So that's definitely a process that happens. And conditioned life, i.e. the life where we're passively identified with some kind of ready-made construct of what it means to be a person, is like an addiction, because this ready-made construct of what it means to be a person comes with all sorts of promotional material saying you can have a great life like this. Jump on board, there's a great life in store for you here. So we do. That isn't what society is all about, going along with all the promotion that exists for the conditioned identity, this self who we are said to be. So when we do get interested, and not just a little bit interested, but in a very, very deep way, we actually want to know the truth because we're fed up of all the non-truth, the bullshit, all the lies. Then that is the requisite thing that has to happen before we can start off with the conscious process. And the conscious process is basically the ongoing process whereby we become able to discern what is truly us from what is not us. And at first that's really, really difficult because it's so confusing. It's so easy to be mistaken. But as we progress, the more time we spend assenting to this conscious process and going along with it, it gets easier and easier. It gets more and more clear what is essence and what is personality. So we all know in the Temple of Apollo that the inscription above it is whatever the ancient Greek is for know thyself. And that's such a familiar thing to us. But we don't understand it at all. We think, oh yeah, I understand it. Know yourself, of course, yeah. That makes sense. That's good advice. But we're completely deluded because we don't know ourselves. We just know this false identity, the persona, the personality that we think is us. The message in modern times, in this modern world of ours, isn't know yourself, which 3,000 years ago or whenever it was, that was the message in ancient Greece. Now the message is passively identify with the fake self, or passively identify with who we say you are.